Okay, the lights are on and we are home. Come on inside. It's time for AP US Government, friends. You know who I am, Miss Hitch from TJ in Alexandria, Virginia. Let's take a look at what we're going to talk about today. So, today, our goal is for you to analyze textual stimulus so that you can explain how linkage institutions, that's a hard word, influence the election process. And you'll know it when you can can successfully analyze and make an implication of how textual stimulus might affect representation. Wow, I'm doing great today. We're off to a good start. So, our prereqs 1.3 government power and individual rights. We're also going to tie this into congressional behavior and campaign finance, everyone's favorite topic. We'll be working on our source analysis skills, looking to see how implications of author's argument or perspective might affect principles, institutions, processes, policies, and behaviors external to the prompt, and explain how campaign organization strategies affect the election process. Today's another really jam packed day full of information. So I will be running through the content again to make sure that I get it in 45 minutes to the best of my ability, just so you know. Okay, today, thank you once again to Mr. Ellery. He was the one who caught my trust fall, right? The Australian ballot characteristics. We're looking at designated voter locations is what I was struggling to get out yesterday. And I also want to say thank you for the MFE corner to my new friends, Hannah and Maddie. Hannah, she created a Twitter account just to tell me that I had to fix something so that I made sure that we're all straight. Both of you caught an error that was on my slide deck. And so here it is. I had said that 50% of the GOP delegates are awarded by mid-April, and that's not true. It was the Democratic. So I had repeated. You can tell I cut and paste and I didn't go back and change it. So thanks to both of you so much, my friends. All right, so our question number one for today, and I had to do a double take on this because Eric Chen from California, San Diego, I also have an Eric Chen in my classes this year, and I miss my friend Eric, just like I miss all of my students. And I bet you Mrs. Dupas also misses you guys very much. In fact, all of your teachers miss you. So make sure you give them a great big hug because they are doing an amazing job worrying about you and making sure that you're ready for the test and taking care of you to the best of their ability in this time of social distancing. Okay, so Eric asked about Australian ballot and wanted to know if the fourth characteristic that it's only distributed at the poll would work in for absentee mail-in ballots. And it's a fantastic question. It's such a good question that today I spent about an hour doing research on my online databases that I have access to through my school, because that's the first place that I always go. And then I wanted to make sure, so I had to reach out to an election official here in my county of Fairfax County, Virginia, to get some assistance. So thank you so much to my friend Patty, who's over there at the election office in Fairfax. And so you are onto something there, Eric, and that's a great thing. So AC Burnham, like we have to go back and think about why was the Australian ballot a thing? If you've ever read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, there's a scene in there where they talk about voting and voting fraud. They're at a bar, there's drinks being poured, they're paid for, meals are being paid for by the political parties, they're handing out ballots, and all you had to do is put the right ballot into the right box, and that is called political corruption. And so one of the things that we see during the progressive era throughout the states is this idea that we need some reforms to come in and to help with this thing called the secret ballot. I mean, we're trying to cut out voting in bars. We're trying to cut out ballots being printed by parties or provided by individuals on a scrap sheet of paper. That, if everybody has a different size paper, everybody has a different color paper, then you're running into the possibility of stuffing the ballot box. And even beyond that, I mean, voting via voce, which was done in public squares where you just indicated preference by stating yay or nay, which is something that they still do in Congress today. All of that leads to the possibility of corruption. So during the progressive era, many states rolled out trying to have an Australian or a secret ballot, and it had four characteristics: printed and distributed by the public expense. Names of all candidates qualified for the ballot on each office contest marked in secrecy and distributed within the polling place. And so my friend told me that this is it, that this is the distribution within the polling place that makes an absentee ballot not an Australian ballot, not a secret ballot, because of that fact. It comes from your it does come from your local election board, but you're not receiving it at the actual precinct that you've been assigned to. So it's a little less secret. A lot of states will try to like have you double envelope it, where you sign on the outside envelope that, you know, you have to put your name and your address in there so that you can verify that you voted, and they can like make sure that you're a registered voter and all of those different kinds of things. And it's a legal document. It's signed in pen. That means it has legal implications if you didn't sign it and somebody else did. And then you take your ballot and you put it inside of a second envelope, which is inside there. And so they're only opening that outer envelope to make sure that your vote matter, or that your vote should count, and then putting it into a kitty where it becomes anonymous. And that's a way of helping it to be secret, but it doesn't fit that definition of an Australian ballot. So great job, Eric. My next question is coming from my friend up in Minnesota. Hello, Muthu. Eagle Ridge Academy. Shout out to Mr. O'Brien. Wants to know if our votes are being more symbolic, if we're voting for electors, da 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 da. How do we become an elector? And that's a fun question. So remember that there's some constitutional considerations. We always start in the Constitution, always, 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 right? What does it say? That's the rule book for the game of politics in America. So we're looking, number one, that the number mirrors the sum of representatives and senators for each state. We know that, +3 for DC. Thank you very much to the 23rd Amendment. Number two, you cannot, according to the Constitution, currently hold office, federal office, or hold an office of trust. So you can't be a member of the House, you can't be a member of the Senate, you can't be cabinet members and things of that nature, right? And then they leave the qualifications to the states, mirroring the concept of federalism and the founding fathers' concern that states had an influence in this process, which we start federalism next week, and I'm so excited to get into that because it's so much fun. I love the Constitution. All right, so beyond that, mirroring federalism, we see states have various different ways. There's no single way to become an elector. Some states will elect positions at their state's party convention prior to the national party convention. Sometimes party leaders will select the electors, leading to lots of political insiders acting as electors. So it kind of feels a little bit like cronyism, but I'm not making that allegation. And then we have this concept like, can we have people who are supposed to vote the way that the public indicated preference, right? And yeah, sometimes we have these things called faithless electors. It was in the news in 2016 of people who just couldn't commit. And so some states will fine faithless electors, maybe $1,000, and some don't. And again, why is this left to the states? Because it's kind of where that state, the two parties have made a determination, plus, you know, outside influence from the people who live within that state in terms of how they feel like overseeing that process. Okay, so we have this warm up. This here was from the decision Bush v. Gore in 2000. So I pulled this down from from OIE. I also went ahead and I kind of put some stuff in here. So, you know, I'm sure you guys know this, but anytime you see those brackets, not a parentheses, but a bracket, that's like contextualizing information. Maybe I'm changing pronouns or things like that so that we can understand what's happening in the passage. And so you were supposed to read the excerpt and explain the rationale. So yesterday I got flummoxed because I was rushing towards the end. What I was told, when this is a big brain moment, this is a pro tip, is that if you ever want to pause something and work through it while I'm live casting, you can, and then you just hit play and it picks up right where I left off. So I can move ahead quickly, but if you need more time with the prompt or the reading, then you can while I continue on down the road. So this is our evaluate. This is kind of like walking through that sequencing of understanding, making sure you kind of really understand what's getting at that textual passage. Here we see that the topic is the evaluation of the decision of Florida to recount ballots in the 2000 general election. There's a position because this is a holding. So that means that it is a position taken on interpreting the Constitution coming out of the Supreme Court. backed up with evidence that's rooted in precedent, that's rooted in tradition, that's rooted in the reading of the law, so on, and the Constitution, and all of those different things. So the per curiam decision, which means that it comes from the court kind of like without naming who voted which way or whatever, is that in order to equitably protect all voters, a recount can't be done within the time allocated. That's essentially what was determined. And so they give evidence in this passage. There's more evidence, obviously, that came out of the Supreme Court decision than I gave you. I only need you to pull it from the part that I selected. So the Constitution requires equal protection and due process. That comes from the 14th Amendment. That's a huge concern, right? Out of 14th Amendment protection for due process and equal protection, out of topic 2.3, when we talked about gerrymandering and things like that, redistricting, that governs much of this process. And we have a tradition going back to just after Baker v. Carr, in which one man, one vote becomes our principle, and kind of giving people the opportunity to go over and over and over again violates this principle. It's unclear according to the court who would recount the ballots. It wasn't a clear direction coming out of the Florida Supreme Court in terms of who's responsible for this. And then those people who were responsible for it didn't have sufficient experience in the matter. And the amount of time it would take for us to have training to be able to expect to have sufficient knowledge and experience was coming up against the Electoral College vote in December. And beyond that, the technology to do so equitably didn't exist at the time. So very much so, we look at Bush v. Gore as a snapshot in time where the court says, we're going to make this decision that there will be no recount. But then they very clearly say, and this is outside of the decision that I handed to you, that this is a one-time thing, that this is not going to set precedent, according to the courts. Because of technological insufficiencies, because of issues with experience and directives and timeliness. So that's kind of where we come from. So how does the reasoning connect to the evidence? Due to unclear standards, a lack of technology to equitably recount, and a lack of human resources, is not possible that the state of Florida can guarantee Florida voters equal protection of the law. So I'm taking all of those different threads and I'm giving you an opinion about them, right? So like those 4 bullet points, those would be the facts. Now I need to take those facts and I need to stitch them together, in my opinion, that helps support whatever that position was, right? Now, of course, I should say, let me backtrack because I kind of misspoke there for a second. The reasoning is not mine. The reasoning is the reasoning of the court. But this skill is going to translate next week to when we start talking about the argumentation FRQ, because we're going to start to see and work on developing, once we've seen how people take an assertion or a claim, provide evidence to support it, and then come up with commentary or reasoning, right? That's what we've been working on this week. Then you are asked to do the same thing in that argumentation FRQ. So we get to practice, right? Okay, so connecting to previous knowledge, how do elections impact democracy? All right, so this is one of my favorite topics. It's about representation. Representation is the cornerstone of American style democracy. We live in a republic, and it is crucial that we understand that anything that happens in our republic has to happen by representing the people's best interests, right? There's like a side step here that I'm going to talk about in a second about what those best interests are, but I will come back around to it. All right, just remind me. Okay, so we're going to walk through 3 phases of representation that we see at any given time in American history. We can look at and say, like, some of these have a higher likelihood of occurring given the period. Virtual is where we're going to start. Virtual representation is something that we had during the colonial era. We did not have a way of indicating preference for who was going to represent us in the British House of Delegate, or the House of Commons. And so it became a problem. So virtual representation was something that you saw in the colonies, but it's also something that was seen back in England too, back in Great Britain. It was a way of kind of leaving it to the political class, to those who have experience and education, to make a determination as to what is the best interest. And so when I say interest here, I want to make sure that we understand that it's not necessarily what you want, it's what you need. And there's a little bit of paternalism that's wrapped in there, because sometimes what we need may not be what we want, obviously, right? Case in point, people want to go outside right now. People want to go play in the parks. People want to go see their friends. But we have a crisis, and that crisis is going to determine what we need, which is social distancing, so that we can allow the disease to run its course before we're reinfecting people. So want and need are two completely different political realities. And the thought is that with virtual representation, we're leaving it to these elder statesmen to make these determinations for us. The next step over is what we call substantive representation, and its substance is that root word there, in which representation means something to stand for. Like, I am standing for the community that has selected me to go on and do whatever. All right. So we have that when you have a representative who has substantive representation, they have authority from the community, but they may not necessarily share a lot in common. So this is the core of substantive representation. And we really saw a lot of this all throughout American history up until the doorstep of maybe like 1965. So that has some problems, because you may have an individual who thinks about what is in your best interest, what's in your best needs, right? Balancing your needs with the rest of society. But at times that also opens the door for individuals' needs to be ignored because there's a stronger preference for some other facet of the community. And that can be incredibly frustrating in democracy. So, with the advent of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there it is again. We have a move towards descriptive representation. And so I think of descriptive representation, I think of standing for through mirroring, right? So you are more likely to kind of, if you look at your district or whatever the geographic areas that you are supposed to represent, the person who holds that office is more likely to share in common with the average voter different demographic attributes. So it could be race, it could be sex, it could be education level, it could be economic background, it could be class. And obviously, it's going to be partisan as well. So that is descriptive. And the thought there is that if you have things in common, you're going to do a better job representing the needs of whatever the average citizen is in that community. But there's one thing that we're missing here, and it's a frequent misnomer, is that this doesn't guarantee right of action for individuals. So you can have descriptive representation, but right of action, if that means that that person can actually carry through with whatever those issues are that you find to be advantageous for you, that you're trying to convince or persuade them to pass laws about, that right of action requires a coalition of people, that requires compromise, that requires debate and deliberation. It requires doing all of the things that happen in a legislative body that oftentimes can be a little ugly, right? It's not just the bill to law process that we all know and love from Schoolhouse Rock. There's very much so, like, people will have to kind of give and take. And so right of action is very difficult to achieve. And that's something that we probably, like, it should be two different things for you, right? Just because you have descriptive representation does not mean that you are going to get what you want unless it is politically advantageous for whomever is in the majority, if you are in a minority group of any type. Okay. So we bring that up because elections are a way, like, that's our linkage institution in which we are supposed to be finding representation, right? So that person who stands at the podium is supposed to be of the people, for the people, by the people. That act of voting for elected officials implies that we are giving consent to our elected officials to be governed. Every time we have an election, we're also not just selecting someone to represent us, but we're also re-signing on that dotted line that we are consenting to being governed, that we are giving up all of the greatest extent of natural rights that we have, that we're going to live in a stable society, that we're going to have predictability, and we're going to have rights and all that other kind of stuff. So we believe our democracy in that point reflects the interest of a pluralist society, is what we're really kind of the best that we have at this point. right? But the health of our republic is founded on our ability to effectively self-govern, which requires a discourse and a marketplace of ideas. We need to be able to turn every stone over, even the stones that make us uncomfortable, right? Ideas need to be expressed. We need to debate them. We need to kind of roll our sleeves up and get our hands dirty, really trying to think about what is the implications of selecting these policies. And that can be an uncomfortable process, right? That deliberation can be very uncomfortable for us because sometimes we have to admit that we're wrong. Shh, don't tell anyone. But yeah, we have to admit sometimes that we're wrong, or we're willing to go without the things that we really want because we recognize that this is better for the public good, for the need of all. But those linkage institutions are constantly evolving and adapting to contemporary conditions, and that's where I really want to kind of push off here. So there's 5 different adaptations that we are going to take a look at: resorting party ideology, shifting media landscapes, proliferation of campaign finance resources, extension of campaigns through perpetual campaigning, and the necessity of professional consultants. So the way that we're going to roll through this is I am going to give you a text passage. And again, if at this point, we're going to work on practicing some of these summary skills, summarizing people's perspectives. What I want you to do is pause. I'm going to present it, and then I'm going to move on because I want to make sure that I'm finished within the time period. Okay, so this is from Bill Bishop, who is a guy who is a journalist, lives in Austin, Texas, at least he did at the time of the publishing the book. It's a fantastic book. Oh my God, I love it. Take a look at this and catch up with us. Okay, so the main argument of this passage, my friends, Bill Bishop is talking about identifying aspects of Democrats and Republicans. He's saying things like Democrats like dogs, Democrats like cats, Republicans like dogs. Republicans love church, Republicans love guns, Democrats love parks. They love TV, they love, listening to the radio, so on and so forth. So he's really trying to describe, he's not like, none of those things on their face are overtly political, right? So if we were to try to argue or summarize what the main argument of this passage is, it's simply that political ideology and partisan preference are expressed in nearly every facet of our lives. And if we start paying attention to the kinds of things that you and I do, we can start to lump people into these groups. And I got to tell you, it's not a secret. This is exactly what parties do. They look at these things that don't have anything to do with politics. They can look at your shoes and say, you like to wear Vans, you like to wear cowboy boots. I'm going to put the Vans people in the liberal. I'm going to put the cowboy boots in the Republican. Now, is that fair? Is it possible for someone who wears cowboy boots to be a Democrat? Absolutely. They're not just looking at one data point. They're looking at hundreds of data points. So follow through with me here. Okay. The thing that Bill Bishop is getting at is that our linkage institutions, this resorting of political ideologies that's happening, is happening at an accelerated rate for lots of different reasons, right? We're not just self-sorting ourselves ideologically by making a determination that you want to listen or that you want to read Alternet versus Breitbart, or you want to read the Washington Post versus the Washington Times. These are ideological self-sorting. And so we're kind of grouping ourselves and we're socializing, right, with the media that we read. We're talking about these things with people online, with people we agree with. And we're going to talk more about this next class. That's ideological self-sorting, right? We know that social media programs are already using algorithms to put us into one group or the other. They're already evaluating even the little things you do, what you like to shop for, what you like to listen to, how you talk, the pictures that are behind you, who you're friends with, to help make a determination of whether or not you're a Republican, a conservative Republican, or a liberal Democrat, or anything in between. But other things that are really crazy to see that comes into this also: falling prices of relocation. It's not as expensive or taxing to relocate. And so it's very easy for us to pick up and move. And when we pick up and move, and it's facilitated by falling prices, and falling levels of effort, we're allowing ourselves to be geographically self-sorted too. So yes, very much so. Just the physical space that you inhabit already has kind of a predetermined bias or tilt that parties are aware of, and they can walk through these They can walk through these neighborhoods and make a determination. You know this. You know that if you live in a city, you're more likely to be liberal. And you know that if you live in the country, you're more likely to be conservative. Is that the only options you have? Absolutely not. But we're talking about statistical likelihood. Statistical likelihood. Things like the advent of air conditioning, it makes it very easy for us to live in places that were previously uninhabitable. Careers, lifestyles, religions, education level, media consumption, urban versus rural divide, all of that corresponds to party affiliation and beyond. So if you're like, wow, that's so cool, read Bill Bishop's book. It'll blow your mind. All right, so this is from Dan Rather, former correspondent for ABC, I believe. I'm sure someone will fact check me on that one. I am going to move on. Why a free press matters. Okay, so I had to cut a lot out because Dan Rather definitely has his own predilections, but he did get at a very nice point here that he believes that based in American history, and we're going to talk about press tomorrow, that it is an essential component to our liberty. And that when it's threatened by our government and our technology and our own it's going to actually impact our ability to be able to develop a decision or develop an evaluation of what is true and what is not. Another great book, Post Truth, last name is McIntyre, fantastic book, blow your mind about this kind of stuff too. So when we get to media, and we're going to talk way more about this tomorrow, so I'm going to roll through this really quickly. The mass media, which is media that is for consumption by the general public, is experiencing this rapid transformation. And it's caused by so many different things. Number one, this demise of objective reporting in favor of political commentary. We like to have pre-digested food. We love commentary. We love the op-eds. We love to know what to think about factual things that are happening. And from about the 1940s to the 1950s, that was kind of the way in which reporting was handled, was a little bit more objectively, but I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow. Right? We have a shrinking universe of newspapers in favor of social media. And there's some things that come out of our reliance on social media. I'm going to skip down to the bottom to talk about that, is that it's much easier for us to consume media that has not been written by professional journalists. Professional journalists, they tend to have higher standards over what would qualify as an objective truth or an objective reporting job because their livelihood is staked on it. They want to make sure that they have an accurate picture to the best of their ability. And if they're fabricating stuff, those are the things that end careers, right? But you can have fake news, which fake news, I just want to make sure you know, is not true. It's not based in fact, right? It would be something like Mrs. Hitchcock owns a cat. Guess what? I don't. That's fake news. Biased news is what we tend to see coming out of our 24/7 news channel, where you're getting facts, but they're layered over with lots and lots and lots of opinion. They're telling you what to think. There's a lot of conjecture and very limited facts. All right, so some other things we have, the rise of media conglomerates. These are companies that own several mass media platforms, even though you may not know about it. I love going to Disney because everybody, if you've ever been on any of the Disney resorts, you know, oh, hey, why over there is ESPN hanging out? And hey, why is Marvel here? Or I can't remember if it's, I don't remember which one it is. So fact check me again. Someone's going to yell at me, I know, right? But you see all of these different media universes that are coming to one because they're all owned by the Disney company. And so that enables them to have a farther reach into our lives. Every time that you're consuming media that comes from that parent company, there is a likelihood that you might get a little bit of their own bias, whatever that might be. This other thing called narrowcasting, in which media platforms are choosing to run stories that confirm the bias of their targeted audience. I'm going to talk about that a lot tomorrow. It is super, super important because when I talk to students, most of the time they believe that that media that's coming to them, the bias is 100% coming from the ownership. It's 100% coming from the reporters, and it is to a degree, but it's reinforced every single day by the people who are there watching the news, right? The news is watched, it opens the door to selling advertisements, and these are for-profit media outlets who are looking to make money. if you're not saying the right thing, if you're saying things that are ticking off your viewers, you aren't going to have the viewership, no eyeballs on that advertisement. That advertisement is not going to run. People aren't going to spend money on things that don't work. All right, the next thing, and this isn't you guys, because you guys watch the whole 45 minutes of this, right? Of course you do. Dwindling attention span of viewers reinforced by sound bites. Did you know that most of the time when you watch the evening news, those stories don't run longer than 3 minutes? And if they have a direct quote from somebody, generally it's been crafted, it's been handcrafted so that it will have a big splash effect, and they know that it's going to get all the eyeballs. People are going to be like, ooh, can you believe what they said? Oh, that's called a soundbite, right? It's usually not longer than 30 seconds, and it's very light on content, which gets us into horse race journalism. And that's the idea that we have a preference today to talk about who's winning elections and the drama around that, as opposed to the very dry and very boring discussion of policy positions. Oh, it's not, that's not my thing. I want the soap opera. I want the drama. I want to grab my popcorn barrel and I want to have popcorn at night. I want to have the ritzy, cool drama that comes with it. The final thing is media events. So many of the things that you and I watch on television are orchestrated. I look at it as political theater. It's been created so that you are curious and intrigued and will watch and will get the message that's layered in it. Okay, so we come to Citizens United. This comes from Heather Gerken and Erica Newland out of a book that's cited at the end. Take a look at it. I'm moving on. Main argument. They're going to make this argument that there is some very real repercussions that come out of this decision, Citizens United v. FEC in 2010, and that the termination of campaign finance laws that create organization, the termination as we saw them out of Citizens United, will create organizations who behave as political parties and now dominate the election process. And prophetic it is. So this, you probably want to sit and pause and really think deeply about this, because campaign finance tends to strike fear in the hearts of teachers everywhere, because it's constantly changing and it is super complicated. It's complicated on purpose. We have been restricting the flow of resources into American elections since 1904 or 07. There is, if you go to the resources that's linked down at the bottom, there is a timeline of how this evolved over time, in case you're curious. And the first restrictions were on corporations spending money in elections, and it went to Teddy Roosevelt. He took money from corporations. As a progressive, that was one of the most reprehensible things he could do. He apologized, and I think it must have been 1907. He turns around and passes a law that's going to prevent people from doing that. But you really need to know the more modern versions of this and kind of where the outgrowth of different kinds of spending. You need to know hard money, right? That is money spent by candidate committees. You need to know that it's regulated by the Federal Election Campaign Act. You need to know that the regulations are caps on donors and donations. Donor disclosure has to be disclosed. If I get money from somebody, I have to tell the FEC. I also have to tell them how much I got. All right. That was soft money. Expand what they meant by that happening, and the kind of advocacy is being done, right? Those are the magic words that it is going to take the cap, the restriction off of corporations from spending money in elections. And eventually it'll be off of unions too. So what you see here is that because 501c4s are nonprofit, fours are corporations, they do issue a limit that keeps them from saying, they do is in a very roundabout way. They'll she was out here and then they'll like besmirch the person who's running. You and I really they're very sophisticated in their rhetoric, for all my AP language out there. They're able to be persuasive, explicitly vote for, vote against, etc. What Citizens United established, that corporations have a right, they have had rights. They've had rights for quite some time. They have the right to religion. They have the right to freedom of speech. They are allowed to talk, and they're in the minds. Actually, I'll get back to why in a minute. So the thing is that 501c4s, because they were allowed, because Citizens United happens in 2010, we haven't had another round of legislation since the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Originally, 501c4s could not engage, as to the extent that they can now, in campaigning for for candidates or whatever. But because Citizens United took that restriction off, now they can. And 501c4s happen to be outside of the types of groups that are regulated by the current federal election law. So the FECA, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, the last time we've had anything come through that was a restriction on types of groups and types of speeches was 2002. So that's why they're allowed to do what they want to. Now, the crazy thing about dark money is that anybody can spend it, and there's no or anybody can give unlimited amounts of money, and we never have to disclose who they came from. That's why it's called dark. We could be taking money, like if I wanted to put $10 billion into the election and I wanted to be completely anonymous, I would just go find my favorite 501c4, or heck, make my own 501c4, throw that money in there. Now, there are some limits. You can only spend half of your money on that kind of stuff, which is why we turn to PACs. Now, PACs have been around since the 1960s, 1950s. It's a way for groups to pool money from corporations, unions, trade associations, and members, so they can speak, right? They do it kind of like in an indirect way. They'll spend money on office rent and equipment and travel and express advocacy, because they're kind of, either there's a door separating the two of them, right? But they are regulated. So there's caps on donors, how much they can give. There's caps on, there's donor disclosure requirement, and there's a donation disclosure amount. So all of these things are run through the FEC. There's a case that you don't need to know necessarily, but I put it in there, called Speech Now in 2010, that was created by a lower court after Citizens United, that's going to create the ability for there to be a new guy on the block called independent expenditure only independent expenditure only groups. We call them super PACs. So super PACs, what they do is, so long as they are not giving money to or they're not spending money to cabinet candidates, to parties, or to PACs, they can accept unlimited money from donors, including 501c4s. And they can spend it specifically advocating for the candidate of their choice. They just cannot coordinate behaviors with that candidate. So what you see here is, back to that $10 billion. If I find my favorite 501c4 and I give it to all the money in one check to them, I can tell them, I want you to pass it on to my neighbor who's my best friend, who's running for president. And you're going to give it not to the candidate, because if you give it to the candidate, there's limits. And then I don't want that. If you give it to the party, there's limits, and I don't want that. So what I want you to do is, I want you to give it to their super PAC. And the only thing that comes across is the name of that 501c4. My name never shows up. So this becomes a really big issue when we're thinking about the ability to be represented, because if money is speech, that's a critical component that comes from Buckley v. Vallejo, that's threaded through all of this. When you have more money, you have more speech. You can talk more, you can talk louder, you can talk longer. And on top of that, this is even crazier, it doesn't necessarily always have to be accurate. We'll talk about that tomorrow. So here are the limits, in case you were wondering. What the FEC currently says is a limit on campaign spending. So Citizens United decided the way that they did. So the facts of the case is, BICRA limited speech on corporations and unions 30 days before a primary and 60 days before the general election. Citizens United, a nonprofit organization, produced a full-length film critical of Hillary Clinton to air on TV. And they Citizens, the group, sought an injunction or a command from a court order to halt action from the FEC before the movie Hillary was aired. They wanted to prevent them from barring them to do that. And so this case made its way to the Supreme Court. Granted, it was 2010, which is very far after 2008, because it's an important question that still needs to be answered. And so the court came back and they said their holding is their reasoning, remember? So it's like facts and opinion. So they're going to say, number one, laws targeting First Amendment free speech warrant the highest level of scrutiny by the courts because it's an essential freedom. So that means that we have to look really closely and make sure that any government action isn't unnecessarily hurting your right to freedom of speech. We'll talk about that level of scrutiny thing later on this month. Free speech, including the use of money as speech, is a right of all persons, including corporations, as media outlets are also corporations, and they're constantly talking. They're constantly telling you how they feel about things. It's through reporting, but if you go look on the op-ed paper, on the op-ed part, or you're listening to any of those talking heads on TV, you're getting opinion mostly. So it's illogical that we can have political speech coming out of the media as a corporation, but not other corporations. And previous court case precedent says that you are allowed to impact speech only when there's a concern of corruption. And the courts, defined corruption as this word that I know that you all know now, which is quid pro quo, which means this for that. Like you literally have to show that there is an exchange of favors between two groups. Crazy. Read it. I'm moving on. The main argument of this is that polling consultants and the media enables candidates to constantly reinvent themselves instead of focusing on policy positions. And when we take a look at polling here, we're looking at the use of scientific polling. Of course, that's using random sampling. That's making sure that every person in the population that you are trying to evaluate has a likelihood of being selected, that you're using questions that are not biased or not leading, and you're trying to figure out the public's opinion. And I said public's plural there because there's more than one type of public out there. We can segment those just like we segment, and look at cleavages between different populations. So we're using this to triangulate language for campaigns to kind of spin their platforms to help find emerging issues that they might become important and might also be what we call a wedge issue, which is something that doesn't necessarily have to be kind of one of the major issues but it's so galvanizing and it's so divisive that you can kind of talk about this sidebar issue and really, really define the difference or the cleavaging between one group in your electorate and the other. Also, it doesn't, some of the problems, it doesn't always find how relevant or salient this is to groups. Relevancy, meaning how often do you think about this? Saliency, meaning like how, to what extent does this inform your political decisions? And sampling problems due to the low population participation from the population makes polling less reliable. Back in the 80s, they used to have 70% of people would agree to be in polling, and today it's 7%, according to Nate Silver of 538. That's insane. So push poll, there's a couple of polls that frequently get reported that are flawed, things like push polls, where it's a biased set of questions that leads respondents. Straw polls, that's like if I were to ask who's in this room, which is only me, how I feel about spaghetti for dinner, and I said yes, that's just a straw poll. I'm not asking anybody else in my household. In exit polls used to help forecast election results, you don't see exit polls happening at every other precinct. They usually go to the ones that are kind of like right on the edge, that could go purple, right? Could go either way, to try to figure out, because they can pretty reasonably predict how many of your precincts will turn out based on all those things I talked about before. And then flash polls, you're opting into those. We see them on the internet all the time. Like if they're on a web page, what do you think about this? Those things on Twitter, those polls on Twitter, that's a flash poll. It's not a scientific poll at all. So this brings us to the necessity for political consultants. And then we're going to have a little bit of guided practice here. And again, I'm going to say that if you want to read this, please pause it and catch up, because I need to make sure that I am out of here in a somewhat reasonable fashion. So take a look at this. This is from Sasha Eisenberg. All right. So we're going to break this down. What's the topic of this passage? Oh, I thought I highlighted it. I didn't. Just kidding. So I'm going to go through all of this. I thought I did it one at a time. Good thing I didn't. Our topic is we want to review campaign mobilization efforts. And so the position of Sasha Eisenberg, who is a journalist, is that the use of behavioral sciences, of psychology and scientific experiments has improved the ability of parties and candidates to mobilize voters, right? We're using high-powered data. We're able to kind of figure out how much a certain particular use of messaging, a way that it's developed, how many people how many more people it might propel to the elections. And really, it's about mobilizing just enough people so that you can win. We know that there's going to be some people who will not show up to win. So this book comes from the Victory Lab, which is another fantastic book that has blown my mind. But it's about almost 10 years old. So I can only imagine where we are now. But we've gotten to the point where we recognize that those glossy mailers that come out that, have big catchy pictures and phrases and things like that, they're not very effective. Things like sending out a message, and I actually have a copy of this in my classroom, but I'm not in it, of just saying, hey, you voted this way. You voted this way in the past 5 elections, or not that you voted this way, but that you voted in the past 5 elections. And then they'll have, I mean, I've received these letters in the midterms. They would say, I voted, of course, I voted in every election because I'm awesome, but my neighbors didn't. And I saw that there are some elections that they did not go to. So that wouldn't impact me, but they have shown that for my neighbors, if they receive the same letter, they're about 2.5 times or 2.5% more likely to show up to vote. And that's all that matters to win that election. So they're mobilizing really, really, really small segments of the population to be able to make sure that there's victory for the candidate, which is reasonable. Things like this are very cheap. They're very easy to do, right? Personalized messages about voting history and other personal but public information makes a connection and a desire to join one's neighbor in who are voting. So this gets us to what parties are there to do, which is to get out the vote. Now, Republicans sometimes call this get on TV because they're rural and they can't go to everyone's house. But get out the vote has 3 steps. 1, identify voters. 2, register them. 3, mobilize them. And this letter writing campaign is a way of mobilizing your voters. Again, are you trying to get everyone to vote? It's going to cost a lot of money to get everyone to vote. So you want to just get enough people that makes it possible for you to win. And believe it or not, campaigns, they even know how they can predict with reasonable accuracy how many people in each and every single district will show up to vote and will probably vote for you, for your candidate. It's insane how good they are at this. So we need to think about, how do we connect this to other things? So what is the rational effect that these issues might have on the kinds of representation that's offered by elected officials? Again, I'm going to move forward. So please, if you are not ready, pause it and think about it. We're looking for causation as a reasoning process here, like cause and effect. So I'm thinking of campaigns. What is an effect of this? All of these things that we just talked about. Campaigns are more aware of public sentiments via polling. That's good. It's increased ability to reach sympathetic voters. Also amazing. It's more money means better research and capabilities to improve leadership, as they improve. That's awesome. Public is more aware of officials running for races. Bueno, right? But where is it bad? Well, candidates are less concerned with leading and more concerned with following, or at least it feels that way. That the quality and reliability of messaging decreases because they're only trying to mobilize or micro target smaller and smaller segments of the population. If you are a dyed in the wool partisan, they're not going to spend time with you, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, because they know you're going to vote and they know how you're going to vote. So your interests are not being heard or replicated. More money comes from less people, and therefore it's less likely to reflect the interests, the needs of everyone. And the public is less aware of the content on their platforms and less able to keep elected officials accountable. So here's a couple things. I know I gave you a couple of other books, but if you're looking to, just continue to hang out with screens in this time, there are some things that I recommended. A lot of teachers show Big Sky, Big Money. Oh my God, it's amazing. I watched the Netflix's The Great Hack, and I'm gonna tell you, I almost fell out of it took me 2 nights. I got so emotional. I'll leave it at that. It's amazing. Watch it today. And then if you're looking for something to play, I love playing iCivics Win the White House because it kind of brings this stuff and stuff from last class into fruition. And just think about how gamifying this process, how accurate it is to real life. It's a great exercise because they have to give you like a summary. You can get a little more realistic. So checking for understanding. Again, we're flying through this. Take a look at it. I'm moving ahead. The answer there is soft money. You're going to need to stop and read this jam for sure, right? I'm moving ahead because we're out of time. It's B. And here's we are. We went through all of this. This is one of the bigger units that we have to cover because there's so much information in here and it is so fascinating. This is one of my favorite topics. Your homework for tonight is to tackle this right here. All right. It's the PowerPoint's uploaded. Complete this chart on your own. And when we come back, we're going to talk about answering this question. And that is it for me. Again, we want to know if you need a device or internet access, please reach out to us at cb.org/tech. It's super important. We care about everybody getting their needs fulfilled. Thank you for watching. Here are my resources for the day. And bye-bye, friends. We'll see you tomorrow.